Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. In this series, I speak to people who can help us to understand the risks posed by human decision making and what we can do to mitigate them. Now, one of the ways that we can manage human risk is to compensate for the flaws that are built into our thinking by ensuring that different opinions are heard before decisions are made. We've all seen examples of overly powerful individuals making bad decisions, or of groups of people of a similar mindset agreeing to a course of action that, with hindsight, turns out not to be so smart. That's why I'm a huge fan of diversity as a risk management tool. Of course, as I've explored in previous podcasts, to be effective, diversity also requires inclusion. Having the opinions available isn't enough. You need to listen to them. Now, one way you can avoid listening to them is through prejudice, whether inadvertent or deliberate. And it's the theme of prejudice that my guest this time, Paul Donovan, explores in his new book. Paul is a well-respected economist that will be known to many of my listeners, and he's just written a book called Profit Prejudice, The Luddites of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. What Paul explores in his book are the economic arguments against prejudice and why businesses and society should be resolute in rejecting it. In his analysis of why prejudice happens, he highlights many of the behavioural dynamics that lead to prejudice and why these flaws in our thinking produce bad outcomes. It's a really insightful read and I can't recommend it enough. Because although he approaches the topic from an economic perspective, all the points he's making are equally valid from a human risk angle. If you've ever heard Paul, you'll know you're in for a treat. And if you haven't, stand by to be amused and informed. So please enjoy my conversation with Paul Donovan on prejudice. Paul, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you. And look, before we move on to talk about your book, I wonder if you could let us into the secret as to how you came to write it, because it's not an obvious topic for economists to cover.
Well, I suppose it all began sort of back when I was doing the day job and thinking about longer term trends in economics and what influences longer term trends in economics. And one of the issues is about how you use your population, how you use your workforce. I mean, that's a key part of economics. And so I did some initial work on prejudice and how that impacts long-term growth. And then coming on from that, I sort of came back to the topic from time to time. But what really prompted the book was around the debate in marriage equality in the UK. And one Saturday lunchtime, I was listening to the BBC's Money Box programme on Radio 4, and they were discussing some of the economics around marriage equality. And the issue had me choking on my morning cup of tea because the debate was just not focusing on the right areas, and the harm and the damage that treating one group in society as being less than another group was just being ignored. And so that really sort of motivated me. And I spent Sunday of that weekend writing an article on the economics of marriage equality, which was then published. And that really started to spur things. And it just sort of exploded from there.
And what I found fascinating, I mean, I approach this topic from the perspective of actually, if we're not getting the most out of it, we're going to cause risk because we're going to miss things. But you approach it, and we get to the same point, but you approach it very much from the perspective of this is just not a good use of resources. And in fact, this is hugely disadvantageous. And so the normal arguments, I would say, that apply to sort of the moral argument, which is the number one thing that people seem to use. I come at it and say it's bad for risk. You come at it and say just economically stupid.
It is. I mean, to take something as valuable as human resources and just throw it away is horrendous. I mean, it's just grossly inefficient. And one of the examples I cite in the book, which just underscores this, is from baseball in the United States. So baseball, which, as I understand it, is some kind of inferior form of cricket, is obviously very popular in the United States. And in the mid-1940s, they desegregated baseball teams. Previously, baseball teams had been segregated on racial lines, which is just complete nuts. They desegregated. Some teams embraced the desegregation, and some teams said, no, we're going to continue to be racist in our hiring policies. And the teams which embraced desegregation had better results in terms of the baseball. They had more supporters, and they were financially far more successful overall. And yet it still took years for the racist teams to abandon this and go to the logical way of thinking. So, I mean, the economic arguments here were blindingly obvious, and yet they weren't being followed. So I think it's a very good example of irrationality coming through. And of course, from your perspective, you're quite right. I mean, risk is just as big an issue as well. The risk is coming through there in clearly. You're risking your business, you're taking the wrong decisions by following this completely irrational hiring policy.
I mean, you expose beautifully, and that example you've given is one of many that in the book where I found myself reading and nodding and just go, well, this is so blindingly obvious, as you say. And yet, clearly there are large swathes of businesses and people in the world that don't think in those terms. And I wondered why do you think it is so difficult for people to grasp something that small children intuitively understand?
So I think really there are two issues here. So one, which I highlight very early on in the book, because this I think is really quite serious. When we get structural change in the economy, when there's upheaval, as we're going through now with the fourth industrial revolution, what you end up with is, of course, some people find their social status goes up, and some people find their social status goes down. And if you're on the group that's going down, it can be very hard to understand why that's happening. And so there is this natural tendency to try and find an explanation. Now, the explanation is normally massively complex. I mean, economics is massively complex, which is why only economists can understand it. So you've got this massive complexity going on, and people just don't necessarily grasp all of the nuances and so on, so they go for the simple solution. And the simple solution is, my income's going down, or I've lost my job, or I can't find work because that immigrant's stolen it. Those foreigners are not being fair in trade. Whatever it is, you find a scapegoat. And that, of course, does lend you to the prejudice, which is so particularly corrosive overall. And so that desire for simplicity, coupled with complex changes, which are turning your world on its head, perhaps pushes you towards prejudice. The second thing is also related to complexity. We live in an extraordinarily complex world. I mean, how can anybody other than an engineer explain properly how a washing machine works? You put a bunch of chemicals in a little pouch, and you put your clothes in and you press a button, and that's how it works. You don't actually understand it because it's far too complex. So what do? We naturally go to rules of thumb, nice simplistic assumptions. This is generally right, so that's the rule I'm going to follow. But that, of course, leads to prejudice, because you're creating gross generalizations about groups based on irrational characteristics, and you're therefore making hiring decisions or work and business decisions based off these rules of thumb. So the rules of thumb is something also that contributes to prejudice. So you can understand why companies go down the route of prejudice. It's not by any means desirable. It's very, very damaging to the business, but you can see how people are seduced by the simplicity that prejudice tends to offer.
You talk in the book a lot about your family and obviously illustrate examples from history. And again, the bit I find fascinating is it sort of plays into this, we never seem to learn. So there are lots of parallels, some of which are highly valid, some of which are a little bit crass. But we can go back to Germany in the 1930s as a good example. We're seeing lots of sort of repeat performances. If you watch TV images nowadays in black and white, you could be forgiven for thinking you're watching bygone era. And I'm fascinated by this. We don't seem to learn as a species. I mean, it is just repetition of the previous thing. So as you talk in the book about progress, technology, in many respects, there are lots of things that are significantly better. On the other hand, we are defaulting back to traditional behaviors that you would think things like the Second World War might have taught us, a valuable lesson about.
Well, of course, one of the problem is that's a very different generation to the generation that's being affected now. So I talk about my grandparents' generation, and at least according to family history, the fact that my great uncles, who were dock workers, low-skilled dock labourers in the East End of London, were in all probability fascist, which, of course, in the UK was extremely unusual, though the fascist movement was largely working class and it was largely focused on East London. Because, of course, the chaos of the Great Depression devastated global trade. We all know this, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act and so on. And the workers in London docks were severely damaged. And the loss of social status here was crippling. My late grandmother was throughout her entire life terrified of debt, because debt for her meant going along to see uncle. And uncle, of course, was the pawnbroker at the end of the street who would take your family possessions in exchange for a pittance of cash to be able to feed yourself. And this, for her entire life, she was terrified of debt. Someone of my generation doesn't have that experience, doesn't have the terror of debt, goodness knows. And so you've seen a shift come through, and a lot of those memories are just lost, because we're talking now 3-4 generations ago in many, many cases. And so now, of course, you've got a generation which doesn't have that direct link to the terrible damage that prejudice could do, but is still sort of vulnerable to the complexities of what's going on. And you touched on technology, and the technology arguments here, in some ways are extremely positive, and in some ways are extremely negative. Researching this book at times was deeply depressing. When I spent a couple of months doing a lot of detailed research on white supremacist movements in the United States, and that was just a horrific period. It was really just awful. And then I came on to research some of the more positive aspects of technology, and they mirror each other. So one of the positive aspects, let's start with the good news, is that you do bring minority groups together. And a lot of technology is, in some sense, democratizing. So things like podcasts. There's a certain expense to getting the equipment for a podcast, and of course, you have to have the leisure time. So if you're working 3 jobs, you're unlikely to be able to do a podcast as well. But you have a wider number of people able to access and communicate and address minority issues. And so, for example, one of the podcasters I interviewed, the 2 hosts of the Gayish podcast, which is about LGBTQ plus issues, were saying, well, we've got followers, people who listen to us in Saudi Arabia and in Russia. And these are people who are in very, very persecuted minorities in those countries, but they feel part of the global community. And of course, you can interact and you can debate and you can talk to the podcasters on social media. And so that's enormously helpful in terms of forming these networks. And then these networks can then go on to form protest movements, to boycott, to demonstrate. And so there's some examples I give in there about the Women's March in Washington back in 2016 was a Facebook post from a woman who had never organized anything in her life before in terms of mass protest. And it triggered this enormous explosion of demonstration, of resistance to oppression in Washington. Not something directly related to prejudice, but on economic power, the great cottage cheese boycott of Israel, where people come together on Facebook and it changes economic policy. So you've got this really, really positive power. But then there's the negative. And the negative we've got to remember is extremist groups are also minorities. And because social media is this great democratizing influence at bringing together minorities, that brings together the persecuted minority, but it also brings together the minority who persecute. And that's where you get these horrendous tales about what is orchestrated over the white supremacist websites and so on and so forth, and the spreading of fake news, which just encourages so much of the damage and prejudice that we see. So there's good news and bad news here.
One of the things that it strikes me is that we haven't had the stock market and investors really pushing this point. And we've seen it with sort of other areas of sustainability. So people are recognizing that investing in sustainable businesses, things that don't trash the environment, is a good thing. We haven't yet seen that same logic seemingly applied to what you're talking about.
So I think it is starting to come onto the agenda. So we are seeing more and more discussion around certain forms of diversity and inclusion, as it were, the flip side to a lot of the prejudice debate. I would argue that at the moment this is still relatively narrowly focused for fairly good reason. So something like gender is generally, not always, but generally a fairly visible form of, are you prejudiced or are you inclusive? You can generally tell. And so there's quite a lot of focus on gender diversity in companies, the way this makes better decision making, and so on and so forth. But of course, the problem with prejudice is any form of irrational discrimination, and it doesn't have to be visible. So sexuality is a very obvious case. Some forms of disability, race occasionally is not particularly visible. Religion, mental health issues, the whole range of issues around which diversity is very, very difficult to measure, and there just isn't the data. So I think this is one of the challenges that investors are finding. I can't pull up a nice graph of prejudice and plot it against a measure of economic performance or corporate performance, because of course there's nothing that you can do. The best that you can come up with, I think, a lot of the time is to say, well, this has got a genuine, diverse, inclusive culture, and that is contributing to its success. But there's no sort of nice econometric model that you can use to pull this together, which is why I think a lot of what we economists have to do is narrative economics. We've got to tell the story properly. And unfortunately, this is something economists are not very good at doing as a general rule. Physicists are better than an economist on social media, which is a pretty dire state of affairs, frankly. So we need to be a lot better at communicating the stories that are involved here in order to get the message across. And I think that will push it further and further up the agenda for many investors. One thing I would say, of course, is it is very clear when we look at things like the World Values Survey, for example, the younger generation is a lot more sensitive to this. And that is something that clearly matters to them as consumers, and it matters to them as employees. So I think that as the younger generation age, they will be paying more attention to this as investors, but also, of course, investors will pay attention to the attitudes of the millennial generation, Generation Z, that are a lot more going to be a lot more influential in the next few years as they sort of come into their peak earning period. And so that too, I think, will help push this issue up the agenda.
And how have you found sort of reception of what you're saying? I mean, is it, again, because it struck me that, as you were talking there, as you say, younger people seem to get this. And it's not something you have to teach them. It's intuitive. Whereas it's clearly, there's much more of a generational issue there. And I find it fascinating when you look at younger people get it naturally without, you were saying experience plays a key component. And if you have experienced a particular thing, you'll react. Young people clearly haven't experienced that in many cases yet. Although some of them in terms of employment are starting to see some of these dynamics. So clearly there's a generational challenge there. How are people receiving this in the people that you speak, people that can have influence to change it? Because one of the challenges for younger people is obviously they can have a certain amount of influence using the technologies you've talked about, but they're clearly not in charge.
So one of the problems, of course, is that you get quite a lot of variety of opinion as you travel around the world. So you occasionally run into conflicts between different groups who say, well, my rights are being challenged by you're standing up for these rights. So I mentioned earlier that I'd written research on the economics of same-sex marriage, and I got a lot of hate mail for that. Why is an economist writing about this? This isn't your area. You should be concentrating on the market. Stop worrying about this sort of thing. It doesn't concern you. And of course, quite a lot of it was also about religious rights. Well, no, my religion doesn't believe this. So therefore, you're challenging me as a potentially minority group in terms of my religious beliefs. And of course, this isn't people necessarily being malicious. They're genuinely saying, well, this is my belief and you are attacking me for it. The way I try and view this is to say that I think the guiding principle here should be do no harm. That is to say, if you are putting in place a policy which says this group is somehow less than, and that's the key phrase, if you are less than, then that is not acceptable. You have to say, no, everybody is equal. We're not saying one generic group in society is less than another generic group, or the rights of one group in society are less than the rights of another group. And if you follow that principle, I think you can come up with a successful resolution to these conflicts. But these conflicts do exist. And to somebody who has very deeply held beliefs of whatever nature, it can be very, very difficult to challenge those deeply held beliefs. As you said, the younger generation perhaps does have a different view, but it's not. We shouldn't assume that this is all younger people are necessarily free of prejudice. The white supremacists I was talking about, one of the case studies there is of at the time somebody who was 19, 20 in an American college. David Duke, the former Ku Klux Klan leader's godson, and a clear leader of white supremacy in the views of his family, who eventually changed his views, and he talks about how he went through that. Well, there's a case study that I use of Danish students, high school students, who were willing to take a pay cut if they didn't have to work with somebody who had a different sounding name. So it was a case of Muslim versus non-Muslim. So somebody with a Muslim sounding name would take a pay cut to make sure they didn't have to work with somebody with a Danish sounding name. Somebody with a Danish sounding name would take a pay cut to make sure they didn't work with somebody with a Muslim sounding name. And this is 16-year-olds. And they're taking, I can't remember the precise number, it was about 8 or 9% pay cut to avoid working.
Well, that's literally putting money where your mouth is, right?
Exactly. They were required to work together for less than an hour. And they were prepared to take a pay cut. I mean, it's remarkable. And again, it's because of the culture we're surrounded with and other aspects. So different countries have different prejudice. We're all prejudiced. Everyone has prejudices, these rules of thumb that we follow and so on. And so I tend to find that I run into different problems in different areas when I'm talking about this topic.
And it's fascinating because you talk about sort of these heuristics, these rules of thumb that we use to navigate the complexities of the world. So to a certain extent, you could argue that prejudice is helpful, that it allows us, as you say, I don't need to understand the complexity of certain things because I have these shortcuts. So it's a very small leap, as you point out, from shortcuts that might be useful and sensible to ones that are dangerous. And that's an interesting piece. And then the second bit as you were talking occurred to me is sort of by default, the people that you're speaking to feel like you're prejudiced against them. So there's a lot of sort of interesting visceral human pieces here that you're really butting up against. And it goes to the heart of how we operate and how our brains work.
No, absolutely, and of course, this is the problem that, as I was saying earlier on, that in a world where everything that you've clung to in terms of not just income but social status, which is very often more important, is being turned upside down. You feel attacked as your starting point, and then you've got some white middle-aged bald economist like me coming along and saying, well, you're being prejudiced, stop it, it's bad. And you just feel even more attacked. This is why the communication, why the narrative is so important and so critical. One of the things, and this is where I think the media becomes very, very important. One of the things that I was spending quite a lot of time looking at in the book is a key way of challenging prejudice, which is two theories coming together, parasocial theory and contact theory. So one of the great things in terms of defeating prejudice is to get to know people of different backgrounds. And that is enormously helpful in terms of undermining prejudice, because prejudice dehumanizes people. Prejudice is saying they are less than, and you very often end up with they are less than human. And if you get to know people on the same level, then that is all rejected. That goes out the window. So again, to come back to the examples of my great uncles, the British Union of Fascists in the East End of London had to change their strategy. Originally, it was anti-Semitic. And then they subtly tweaked it and said, no, we're not anti-Semitic, we're against rich Jewish people, not against the guys who are your next door neighbors, because you know them and they've been friendly to you and you like them. No, we're against the rich Jewish group. That's the group that's causing all the problems, and the normal anti-Semitic nonsense. So that's a good example of how that sort of thing works. So contact theory, getting to know people, helps reduce prejudice. And then we've got parasocial contact. So parasocial theory sort of developed actually again in the 1930s, that people start to become, quote, friends with the people that they hear on the radio or see on the television. If you're interacting with somebody on a regular basis, you become, quote, friends with them. You feel involved in their lives. They're fictional characters, but you become involved with their lives and you feel that bond. And so you start to have, quote, friends in the virtual world, radio in the 30s, television in the 50s, and so on. Well, now what you've got is with this mass of social media, with the podcasts, with the YouTube videos and TikTok. I don't understand TikTok, but apparently you get the same sort of social media effect. And people feel a bond. They feel close to the people there, and they're part of their lives. They're hearing their day-to-day stories. They're their friends, even though they may be thousands of miles away and in totally different groups. And that does help break down the barriers of prejudice. And of course, it's even more powerful now because the content creators are not just broadcasting out, they're interacting. The comment section of the YouTube video, the comment section on a Discord server related to a podcaster or whatever it is, allows for debate, allows for interaction. So you feel actually a really close friendship with somebody you've never met, possibly never spoken to in a normal situation. And if they're from a different background to you, that can help break down that prejudice. So that's, I think, that's one of the cheerful conclusions to come from all of this, that there are ways that we can fight against the prejudice, and this is one of the ways where we can challenge our rules of thumb and our stereotypical view of the world.
It strikes me it's highly ironic when you've got people that are, they hear what you're saying and they find it difficult. So they clearly understand the dynamic and understand what it must feel like, because that's what they're expressing as an argument against you. And yet it doesn't necessarily resonate that is what they are doing to other people.
Exactly. Well, I mean, it's always very difficult to admit prejudice to yourself. And so someone I interviewed for the book, a fund manager, had this fantastic quote. So she just said, I'm the ideal person to talk about prejudice because I'm a woman, I'm Jewish, I'm lesbian, and I'm short. And she said, this just makes me the ideal candidate. And she said, in my life, what I have tried to do is make people feel a little bit uncomfortable. You don't want people feeling very uncomfortable, because then they become defensive, then the barriers go up. And if you feel really uncomfortable, then you resist. But if you make someone feel a little bit uncomfortable, what you are doing is forcing them to challenge some of their internalized stereotypes, rules of thumb, preconceptions, whatever it is. You're causing them to think a little bit. And if you can do that, then you can help people to recognize that actually maybe I am being prejudiced. And ultimately, that's what we've got to do. There's only so far you can go in saying, no, you mustn't think this way. I mean, it does to some extent help, because if you create an environment where society disapproves of spoken prejudice, of overt prejudice, I mean, that does help. That can help shift the needle back towards a more inclusive and diverse society. But if someone is still prejudiced at the end of that process, there is still a fundamental problem from the economic perspective, from the social and political perspective. So if you can cause somebody to question themselves through making themselves feel a little bit uncomfortable, I mean, that to me is an enormously valuable step. It sounds a little bit harsh that you want people to be sort of squirming in their seats, but that actually is where we've got to go. Reflecting on that, I mean, you said we're all prejudiced. I'm intrigued by how the exercise has changed you, because sort of, on the face of it, you look at it and say, well, he must be incredibly open-minded, because you've clearly been through this process and identified the flaws of prejudice. How do you think about your own prejudice, and how do you sort of de-bias yourself? So it's something which is very difficult to do. And I mean, I'm a bundle of prejudices when it comes to economics. I've got my pet theories, and these are my theories, and of course I'm right. I'm an economist, trust me. And so one thing that I do is encourage my colleagues and peers in academia and social media and other links to challenge me, to criticize me, and to disagree with me. And that can be very, very helpful. There are times when you sort of curse yourself for having opened the Pandora's box of criticism, and you're just engulfed in people disagreeing with you. But that is enormously helpful, I think, in terms of making yourself feel a bit uncomfortable. Maybe I'm not right about that assumption. Maybe I should stop. Just because this was right 10 years ago doesn't mean it's right anymore. Maybe I need to rethink what I'm doing here. Go back and redo the work. And of course, that's part of the problem, that you've invested time and effort in coming up with a set of views. If you're being challenged on those views, it means that all of that time and effort is now no longer relevant and wasted, and you've got to do it all over again. So there's sunk costs here, which you're reluctant to shift. I think what I've also done as well is try to become more outspoken, so challenging prejudice when I see it elsewhere. And being British, one doesn't like to challenge. You tut loudly when you come across something you disapprove of. But actually, it's got to be more than that. You've got to stand up to it. You've got to challenge. I mean, there's a limit, particularly on social media. You don't want to feed the trolls. I mean, that doesn't help. But I think absolutely coming up where you can make a rational point, where you can try and get an argument across, you should be making that. And I think also being more public about instances where I felt myself to be the target of prejudice. I mean, I can remember starting in the city in the early 1990s. You did not admit that you'd been to a state school in the UK, because if you'd been to a state school, you were a barrow boy, you weren't going to have a career. And so I spent a lot of my first few years in the City of London disguising my social background, which is absurd, and it was a lot of stress to have to do, frankly. And so I think trying to be more public about that, it sort of helps challenge a lot of the absurdities that we find around prejudice. So there's a whole mix of things I think we can do. But for me, I mean, particularly the 5 years of researching the book and writing the book, as I said, at times deeply depressing, at times actually very uplifting to research some of these stories. But I hope it has changed me. I hope it has at least reduced my prejudice, and certainly there have been a few moments when I've been, squirming in my seat as I've been reading through research papers or books as part of the background for this.
And it strikes me that ability to change one's mind, that doesn't sit nicely with some of the models of leadership and business success. And we can look at certain political examples, people that have, quote unquote, never got anything wrong. You can look at business leaders who are appointed, and anybody that seems to change their mind is viewed as a negative. Whereas actually, you've rightly pointed out, it's a strength. And it would be a bit weird if we got everything right every moment of our lives, because that would be pretty dull and we wouldn't have serendipitous moments. But it does go against the traditional model. We want strong leadership, and we want CEOs, for example, that know what they're doing, that are single-minded in pursuit of their strategies and don't waver from that. I mean, isn't that what the markets have rewarded, and therefore isn't that part of the problem?
Well, I don't think the markets can reward that anymore. I mean, the sort of the hubris syndrome, where you get the leader who will sit there and patiently listen and say, but yes, you don't understand, I'm the one who's right. And we all have come across people who've been subject to hubris syndrome. And that is increasingly dangerous, because, I mean, any industrial revolution, any period of structural upheaval, it is changing dramatically the way the world works. And this comes back to your point about the damage of prejudice with regards to risk, that if you've got a group of people sitting around a decision-making table that all look the same, all think the same, all have the same background, then you're going to get a monoculture of ideas. If you've got a chief executive who believes they've got some kind of divine inspiration, they know a route that they're going to go down, again, you're going to get a monoculture of ideas. It's going to be their idea. And in a world which is changing, then you are going to have many, many missed opportunities. And what is worse, you're going to miss the risks as well. Because if you can't contemplate something from all different sides, you are going to miss out on dramatic changes. I mean, you may still miss out, no matter how diverse you are, because it is a radically changing world. But the probability of you failing to get the opportunities, the probability of you failing outright because risk overwhelms you, is going to be dramatically higher in a culture which does not allow differences of opinion to come through and express themselves and challenge in a constructive way. I'm not saying, you have fisticuffs at every board meeting, but you've got to be able to have that diversity of opinion coming through. Otherwise, you are absolutely going to fail. That, I think, is actually one of the things which troubles me most these days, is that, again, partly because of the problems of visible versus invisible diversity, that there is a tendency to say, right, well, we must be gender diverse. And I can remember a few years ago, I did a panel on diversity, and there were three of us on this panel. And afterwards, somebody tweeted out a sarcastic comment with a photograph of the three of us sat up at the front. And of course, we were all men on a three-person panel on diversity. And saying, well, this is the problem. This is the lack of diversity. And so I actually responded saying, this was one of the most diverse panels I've been on. You have judged us on one category, gender, and yes, it would have been perhaps better as a panel if there had been gender diversity. But you are making assumptions about our social background, about our religious background, disability, ethnicity, sexuality, and I can guarantee those assumptions are wrong on pretty much all of those cases. And what is more, we had a genuine diversity of views. We had a really lively discussion. And I've sat on mathematically diverse panels in terms of gender or whatever, which have been dull as ditch water, right? Because everyone's got exactly the same social background, same way of thinking, and you end up with the same ideas at the end of it. So my worry is that if we are not embracing true diversity of thinking, that's what we want, diversity of thinking and diversity of experience, which I think is strongly correlated, and we are just looking at superficial markers for diversity, then we're going to miss out as well, and you run the same risks of failing to spot the opportunities, failing to spot the risks, if you are not actually really embracing diversity. And of course, that becomes a lot harder to do because you can't go around asking everybody for extremely intrusive questions to get a detailed model. What you need is to say, actually, this group of people are disagreeing on a regular basis. That's a good group to be making decisions. This group are all saying exactly the same thing and agreeing with me all the time. As much as I would love it if my colleagues agree with my economic views all of the time, that's probably not a good way to be taking decisions in the future.
And it strikes me that the corporate setups and the sort of the governance structures and the way meetings are run and the decision-making processes don't lend themselves to that thinking. So if you look at the sort of simple ways that how would you deal with diversity? Well, let's hire a broader range of people. We'll get them in, and then we put them into a machine that sort of, not literally, I hope, beats it out of them a bit, which is sort of, you can form along these lines, and this is how we think, and this is how we do things, this is how we report structures. So in many respects, it's almost sort of, as you say, solving the photographic problem, the visual diversity piece. That feels great. Job done. Let's move on to the next thing. But actually, it's these underlying structures that sort of almost could give you a really false sense of confidence that you've solved the problem. And unless you start to look at some of those processes and the way that you escalate ideas and challenge with the organization, you're never going to solve this piece. So in many respects, people clearly you have to have the right bodies and brains there. But equally, you need to deal with some of these fundamentals of the structures, the way we run businesses.
No, absolutely. And I think there are many ways of dealing with this. Creating a culture within a company which does challenge is one way. Making sure you have diverse interview pools does a lot to overcome unconscious bias and the rules of thumb that can be very damaging. Because otherwise, we do tend to hire people who are like us, because we form a natural bond with them in the interview process or whatever. So you need to hire people who aren't like you, potentially. So I think that helps. It's going to be very interesting as to the shift to home working, whether this starts to change the approach. And I think it's too soon to tell, is the honest answer. But if we do spend more time working from home, on the one hand, the potential for sort of more diversity in hiring, because you're not sort of spending 8 hours a day in the company of somebody else, may go up. On the other hand, you may feel, well, actually, I want people like me because I need to know that they're working exactly the same way as me if they're 500 miles away on the other side of the country. So mixed possibilities there, I think. on the whole, I think I am probably tending towards the optimistic with regards to how new models of working may actually improve diversity. Because I think just naturally, if you have got a more geographically diverse team in terms of where they're physically working from, you do run increased possibility of different experiences. Now, I may be biased by my own working environment because, of course, I'm in a global company. We've got people all around the world, so I can have a conversation with a colleague in China and a colleague in the United States, and I will get two completely different opinions on exactly the same issue from two highly qualified economists who are using all of their analytical talents on the same problem. And that, I think, is actually very helpful and very refreshing. So it may well be that shifting up where we're geographically based will help. But yes, we need to be more creative in the structures, creative in how we come up with solutions to problems, I think, in the future. The structure of the firm and the structure of decision making is very, very much sort of second or third industrial revolution these days, and that of itself is quite challenging. Another interesting aspect that I think will come out of the fourth industrial revolution is the increase in self-employment, contract working, and so on that we've already been seeing. It's a trend that's come through, and which I think probably does play a larger role in the future. That increases flexibility, and we tend to think about this as increasing flexibility for the employer, but it also increases flexibility on the other side as well. That if you're in a firm where your voice isn't being heard, and you're a contract worker, or you're self-employed, and this is one of a number of firms that you're working for, you just stop working there. And as long as employment opportunities are available, you've got that ease of moving elsewhere. So this cuts both ways as well, and that may also encourage some of these shifts in structures that I think ultimately are going to have to happen.
I was fascinated by in the book when you talked about what jobs are, and this sort of idea that we think about it traditionally. I'm employed by a company and I go and work for them, and that's my job. But as you point out in the book, you can have a business on eBay. You can be doing other things at the weekend, side hustles, I guess, in loose term, in the gig economy. And sort of taking that one stage further, if I'm going to be sat in my bedroom working for company A, it's very easy to change and shift to company B because the environment's exactly the same. So I think the sort of the nature of labour, I thought was a fascinating piece of analysis as a sort of dynamic that I think we're all aware of, but you don't consciously think about.
I mean, this has been it's been absolutely fascinating. Since lockdowns ended, there has been an explosion of business creation. So we've got weekly data in the US and the UK, and we've got monthly data for some other countries. And I mean, the US new business creation is running 40% year-over-year gains. I mean, it would never seen anything like this, and consistently this high. I mean, it's consistently up. Same thing in the UK. The UK data is slightly different because it's actually company formation, so it's a slightly higher threshold. But still, an explosion of corporate creation. France, Germany, Singapore, Japan, across the board. Now, it's a little early to tell. We don't really have a lot of detail on this, and we're dealing with 4 or 5 months worth of data. But it seems to me, looking at this, that what we are seeing is people moving to create portfolios of income. They're not giving up on the day job. But actually, if you're working from home, what does that mean? Well, it means you've got 1 to 2 hours a day more leisure time, because you're not stuck on, London Underground or, a motorway traveling into work. You've now got more leisure time. So what do? Well, you could spend that time watching Netflix, or you could spend that time reading an improving book. I could recommend one. Or alternatively, you could go out and decide, actually, you know what? I've been making knitted tea cozies for years. Why don't I set up a business on eBay selling them? Or, why don't I turn my social media account to greater advantage? Or I've always been interested in this. This has been a hobby of mine for years. It's the old Pygmalion, Humphrey Higgins, happy is the man who can make a living by his hobby. Well, actually, people are making livings by their hobby. And so you're now moving to this sort of portfolio of incomes. And this isn't actually that new. I mean, you go back to the 19th century. If you were a middle-class family in the 19th century, you would let out a room or two to lodgers. I mean, that was considered perfectly respectable, perfectly normal supplement to the household income, help to pay for the running of the household. Well, we're not quite doing that so much anymore, but we have Airbnb. What is Airbnb other than, the 19th century model of letting out rooms? You go back to the 18th century and you have these people who have their central job, and then they've got all these side interests and things that they dabble in. That's exactly what's happening now. So this is something which I think is really starting to accelerate. I mean, you go on to any YouTube creator, and it's so merch link in bio is now the ubiquitous phrase. You can now buy mugs and hoodies and baseball caps. Goodness knows what's going to happen to Main Street sellers of baseball caps. Everyone is buying them online from their favorite merchandise producer. I'm sure your podcast has got merch just waiting to come out.
I was hoping to plug the Paul Donovan baseball cap, which I feel has a niche market.
Yeah, quite narrow niche, I think, in that case. But absolutely, I mean, you're getting all these things coming through. So I think that this is, in some ways, it can be criticized because it's there's a lack of security if you're an entrepreneur by definition, and if people are feeling that they're being forced into this, then perhaps that is something which is negative. But there is also an element of positive to this as well, that you have diversity of income, which actually is just like a diverse portfolio of investments is a very good way of hedging risk over time. And it's not even necessarily selling physical things. I mean, you've now got the Patreon cult, where a lot of social media are using Patreon to support broadcasting on social media. Who needs television and advertising if you've got YouTube and Patreon, or a podcast and Patreon? And that helps to offset the costs of hosting site, and in some cases can provide a viable income as well on top of that. So this is certainly something I think that is very exciting. It's got a lot of potential in the future. I think this is quite an interesting shift in how business operates and how we think about things as individuals as well as companies, and about how life is going to be organized in the future.
And it's interesting because it illustrates, I think, the capability of the human mind to shift positions on things. Because if you'd asked people a year ago, would you contemplate, there'd be a million reasons why they wouldn't be doing it. I couldn't possibly do that, not going to happen. And yet we're all finding ourselves having changed our routines and doing things that we would never have contemplated. So it's almost sort of proving your point that actually there's a lot more flexibility in us than I think structures nowadays have almost beaten that out of us a little bit, in that we're required, work looks like this and we're required to conform to certain patterns. And what we've actually seen is an ability that we don't have to necessarily do that, and we can become more human, which possibly drives towards the dynamics you're talking about.
I think so. I mean, I think there are elements where this can become a very positive development. We become more adaptable. And I talk in the book about, for me, a lot of the success in defeating prejudice and encouraging a more diverse and inclusive culture is around education, but it's around learning, not being taught. If you'll forgive me playing with semantics, by which I mean, you don't want sort of the grad grind rote learning system. If you've got a degree through memorizing a textbook, I'm sorry, but you're a low-skilled worker. And a low-skilled worker that doesn't have much of a future. What you need is the learning, which is about adapting, and it's about acquiring the skills to interpret, use knowledge that you pick up on the way. And of course, the learning process, it goes beyond school and college, university. Learning is a lifelong process. It generally is. And again, we need to become more democratic in our thinking. So there's learning at work. We all learn from work. We learn from each other at work, from the experience that we have there and from colleagues. And that is great. But we also learn outside of work. So we learn through social media. And not just online, formal tuition. I used part of my time in lockdown to learn how to do lime mortar repointing on a brick wall so I can repair my garden wall through watching YouTube videos. So now if it all goes horribly wrong for me as an economist, I've got an alternative not perhaps as a bricklayer, but certainly as a bricky's mate, in terms of what I've learned and the flexibility and adaptability you get from that. So I think that there's an enormous amount of flexibility that can come in, that does come in. And sometimes we just need a bit of a nudge. There's an interesting sort of example here is that if you look at home working, the UK was actually very advanced in home working, relatively speaking, compared to a lot of other countries before the pandemic. More people had started to work from home, at least part of the time. Now, some of that is due to the structure of the UK economy. The UK's got a very high proportion of jobs. Almost 45% of jobs in the UK could be done 100% from home. But actually, I think that the other trigger was the 2012 Olympics. Because, of course, with the 2012 Olympics, Her Majesty's government, in their infinite wisdom, suddenly realised that we've got hundreds of thousands of people coming to London, and they haven't upgraded London Underground properly since about 1872. So maybe persuading Londoners not to travel on London Underground would be a good idea. You remember the campaigns. It was all, work from home, flexible working, all the rest of it. And we did it. And all of a sudden, people discovered that actually they quite liked not having to travel on London Underground every single day. And their bosses discovered that actually, you know what, these people are actually just as productive working from home as they are working from the office. And they come into the office, 3 days a week and work from home 2 days a week. Where's the problem? And so that sort of external nudge pushed people to change. And we end up with a structural change in the UK. And then, of course, we had not so much a nudge as a great big shove with the pandemic, but that again has led to this change. And you look at the statistics about, I don't think people are necessarily wanting to work from home all of the time, but the number of people who are saying a couple of days a week in the office, 3 days a week at home would suit me just fine, that's really something which is starting to be embraced, I think.
Beautiful. I think that's a wonderful, uplifting message to finish on. So just remind us what the book is called and where it's available so people can get hold of it. Thoroughly recommended, clearly.
Thank you. So it's Profit and Prejudice, The Luddites of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, available from all good booksellers.
Fabulous. Paul, thank you so much for appearing on the podcast. It's been as insightful as I knew it would be. The book is fantastic. The conversation's been delightful. Do keep up the good work because I think it's a wonderful mission that you're on and you're doing it in a highly engaging, entertaining way. And it's lovely to see something so virtuous and worthwhile being combined with a passion and an enthusiasm that is very infectious.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the podcast, Christian, and I look forward to buying merch as soon as you've got it available.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Paul for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about his book, Profit and Prejudice, and to benefit from a discount that he's kindly given us, have a look in the show notes where you can order direct from the publisher. Unfortunately, Human Risk Podcast merchandise isn't quite available yet, but rest assured I'll let you know when it comes out. If you're new to the show, you can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major platforms. If you like the show and had a moment to leave a review, that would be hugely appreciated. It really does help. I'll be back with another episode of this podcast very soon, but in the meantime, thanks for listening and stay safe.